very good afternoon once again, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Singapore International Cyber Week 2025. My name is Mike Tan, and it is my honor to be your host this afternoon. We have an exciting lineup of international panelists here with us today to share their perspectives on the theme Securing Tomorrow Today, Bridging Awareness to Action Through Quantum Readiness. And as quantum computing rapidly advances, the conversation around quantum readiness has shifted from awareness to action. Nations, industries, and technology leaders need to plan ahead to embed quantum resilience within digital systems. And this year's high-level panel on Securing Tomorrow Today, Bridging Awareness to Action Through Quantum Readiness highlights the impetus to respond to the growing quantum threat without delay. And as quantum computers edge closer to practical capabilities, systems relying on classical cryptography can become vulnerable, endangering the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of digital systems. And this high-level panel brings together global leaders to chart a pragmatic and collaborative approach towards quantum readiness and safety. Ladies and gentlemen, do join me now in welcoming Mr. Chua Kwan Sia, the Deputy Commissioner of Cybersecurity, Deputy Chief Executive Development of Cybersecurity Agency of Singapore, to deliver his opening remarks. Mr. Chua, please.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to join you at this panel discussion on securing tomorrow today, bridging awareness to action through quantum readiness. As cybersecurity leaders, we face an ever-evolving landscape of threats. So today, I want to focus on one that stands apart in its potential to fundamentally reshape the landscape. This is the quantum threat. Let me briefly explain what I mean. Quantum computing represents a major leap forward in computing power. By harnessing the principles of quantum mechanics, it has the potential to transform industries from logistics and pharmaceuticals to finance and beyond. However, as with any transformative technology, there is a flip side. The same power that can drive innovation could also be misused by malicious actors to break the cryptography that secures today's digital infrastructure. This infrastructure is the very foundation that enables secure communications, protect sensitive information, and maintain trust in the systems that we all rely on today. Progress in quantum computing is accelerating, but in an unpredictable way. Breakthroughs can happen quietly, and no country or company knows exactly how fast others are progressing. While no one can pinpoint the exact date, global security experts agree that the day quantum threat is likely to materialize will be within the next decade. We refer to this as the Q day, quantum day. It is no longer a question of if, but when. This is why quantum safe security matters now. Delaying action until Q day could be disastrous. Businesses risk data breaches and service disruptions, and in turn, financial losses as well as reputational damage. For critical sectors such as finance, telecom, and healthcare, the impact translate to disruptions of essential services that our societies depend on. In the worst case, failure in these systems could even endanger lives. So to put this in perspective, imagine a day where digital trust that we take for granted today no longer exists. Every banking transaction must be done in person because we can no longer be certain that the online transaction is truly with our bank. And even if it is, we will worry that someone would intercept it and quietly siphon money into their own accounts. Now, some governments and companies have also raised concern about the harvest now, decrypt later, where encrypted data is stolen today with the intention of decrypting it in the future when the quantum computer becomes ready. This is particularly worrying for information that remains sensitive over the long term, such as health records, diplomatic communications, or intellectual property. So this makes the urgency clear. Organizations need to begin preparing and planning for quantum safe migration as soon as practically possible. Transitioning existing systems, products, processes to quantum safe solution is a complex and multi-year effort. Now, starting early helps minimize this risk and avoid the pressure of rushing through the processes. While the urgency to act is clear, there remains a gap between awareness of quantum threat and taking concrete steps towards quantum safe security. From our engagements with organizations and solution providers, awareness in Singapore on quantum threat has grown steadily. Many organizations are evaluating their exposure and consulting solution providers to explore the potential migration pathways. Yet, only a few have progressed to actual implementation. This slow adoption is understandable. The quantum safe landscape is still evolving, and there are international standards that still needs to be finalized, commercial solutions that are still maturing, and there is also a shortage of expertise. At the same time, many organizations face competing priorities and limited resources, with cybersecurity teams already stretched to the maximum in managing today's threats. Now, while these challenges are real, they need not hold organizations back, right? Future security depends on the steps that we take today. Unlike Y2K, there is no fixed countdown date. So the longer we wait, the shorter the window for action becomes. Organizations should integrate quantum safe readiness as part of their broader risk management strategy, identifying priorities along with other cybersecurity risks, understanding the potential impacts, and developing practical mitigation plans. Now, at this stage, organizations need not rush into implementation, but should really begin building readiness. Quantum safe migration is a progressive journey, not a one-off project. With standards and technologies still evolving, this is the time to experiment, run small pilots, test your integration plans, and strengthen foundational capabilities. Such efforts can help organizations identify challenges early, build confidence, and ensure that organizations are ready to scale when the migration becomes necessary. I spoke about how an individual organization should prepare for this migration. I would like to add that collective action is equally important. Building a quantum safe future requires close coordination across government, industry, and technology providers to share best practices and align on the standards as well as to ensure interoperability. This is where national efforts can provide direction and practical resources to guide organizations through this complex journey. To support organizations in their preparation, CSA has developed two initiatives in collaboration with public and private sector partners. Right? The first, yes, the QR code, is our Quantum Safe Handbook. It is designed as a practical guide to help organizations, especially critical information infrastructure owners and government agencies, prepare for quantum safe migration. It explains what is at stake, highlights the key area of focus, and sets out practical considerations and resources to begin building quantum readiness. The handbook was jointly developed by the CSA, Government Technology Agency GovTech, and Infocom Media Development Authority IMDA, in collaboration with leading technology companies, cybersecurity companies, and also the professional associations. So we would like you to take the opportunity to thank our partners, some of whom are in the audience today. Thank you very much. The second is Quantum Readiness Index, a self-assessment questionnaire that complements the handbook. It helps organizations assess their current level of readiness, identify quantum-safe priority actions. It also facilitates conversations with senior management on the state of quantum readiness to address the quantum threats. Such an assessment tool can be used to seek buy-in for migration efforts. The QRI, Quantum Readiness Index, was developed in consultation also with experts from the industry. So together, these resources aim to bridge the gap between the awareness and action by providing a practical starting point for organizations to plan and to prepare for quantum-safe migration. Both documents will be released for public consultation from today to 31st of December 2025. So we welcome feedback from CII owners, government, and industry stakeholders, as well as domain experts to help improve and refine these resources and strengthen Singapore quantum-safe readiness. Now, even as we prepare for the risks posed by quantum technology, we recognize that it also brings the opportunities to uplift and transform Singapore businesses. Over the past decade, we have invested more than $400 million to build up world-class quantum capabilities through outfits such as the Center for Quantum Technology. We have also established the National Quantum Office to coordinate the research, innovation, and enterprise effort at the national level. Just last year, Singapore launched the National Quantum Strategy, committing another $300 million to advance the research, strengthen the engineering capabilities, and grow technical and industry partnerships. Singapore is also deepening global collaborations with industry partners, most recently through an MOU with Continuum to access advanced computing resources. This positions Singapore to further develop our quantum capabilities and in turn contribute back to the global quantum ecosystem. Collectively, these initiatives complement our work to strengthen Singapore's overall capabilities to navigate the post-quantum landscape. Collaborations with R&D community and industry, both local and overseas, support us in building a stronger pipeline of expertise and talent needed to advance Singapore's quantum-safe journey. For example, the National Quantum Safe Network Plus, launched in 2024, builds on more than 10 years of quantum research by CQT. It is now an important component of our digital connectivity blueprint and seeks to help organizations safeguard critical business data. We are also deepening engagements with international counterparts to exchange insights, monitor technology developments, and align on emerging standards and best practices. Such efforts will lay a strong foundation to support the wider ecosystem as it embarks on a quantum-safe journey. As we continue on this journey, I encourage every one of you here today to reflect on what it means for your organization. How can you start building quantum readiness for a post-quantum future? What partnerships or pilots would be most helpful? And how will you grow the expertise and capabilities that our systems will need in the years ahead? In conclusion, let me emphasize that Q-Day is not a matter of if, but when. Organizations should start preparing now, but not by rushing into full implementation, but by building readiness through planning, experimenting, and laying the groundwork for a smooth and secure transition. By taking these steps early, we can turn awareness into action and strengthen our collective resilience against quantum threat. Together, we can secure Together, we can secure tomorrow today. So thank you very much, and I look forward to an engaging and insightful panel ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chua, for your insightful address. And for our audience here with us today, you can post questions for our panelists through our Slido platform throughout the panel discussion. You may scan the QR code displayed on the screen, and we look forward to your participation in the conversation. Now, do join me in welcoming our esteemed moderator and panelists for this afternoon, beginning with your moderator, Dr. Colin Sutar, Managing Director, Deloitte and Touche LLP. Please also put your hands together for your panelists, Mr. Michael Osborne, Chief Technology Officer, IBM Quantum Safe. And also let's welcome Dr. Ong Chen Hui, Assistant Chief Executive, BizTech, Infocom Media Development Authority, Singapore. Let's also welcome Dr. Vikram Sharma, Founder and Chief Executive Officer, Quintessence Labs. And last but not least, let's also welcome Dr. Tan Teck Guan, Co-Founder and Chief Executive Officer, PQC. Ladies and gentlemen, your panel, and over to you, Dr. Sutar.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for taking the time to listen into the panel. I'm really excited to hear some of the thoughts that we go through. And it's a pleasure to be here in Singapore. Singapore has really been leading a lot of activities in this space. So it's very exciting to be here and to hear more about it. I think there was a very good introduction there in terms of the context of the panel, moving from awareness to action. I think one of the things that pleased me the most in terms of the context was the relative positioning of the impact on business processes before harvest now, decrypt later. I'll explain why as we go through the panel, but I think it's good to understand from a business perspective what this impact would be. So I kind of want to break this discussion down into a couple of different phases. And we're seeing more of the questions now coming from board directors around, why should we make this transition and why now? I think we'll have a lot of discussion around that. Then you get into the what do we need to transition? And I deliberately want to position it the why before the what, because we have seen a couple of years ago, a lot of companies were jumping in and trying to do something without really understanding the why and the strategy around it. So I want to try and tease that out a little bit. Next, getting into how do we plan? And then maybe the most important thing is, when are we done? And that's sort of an open-ended question that I hope to hear some debate on. Very pleased to have many years of experience in this topic on the panel collectively here. I think even more pleased that there's other disciplines that are represented. Quantum is an interesting topic, and quantum is the threat that we are talking about today. But I think as we go through these discussions, you'll hear that a lot of the mitigation and steps and planning and so on, they're not that unusual from steps that are taken, or at least should be taken today. So I want to try and tease that out a little bit too. So to get into the why transition, and I'll ask a couple of questions of the panelists around that. I was trying to explain to my kids before I came over here what I was going to be doing, and I gave them a little bit more detail than normal. And my 6-year-old turned to me and said, "Oh, okay, so there's new standards." I guess he kind of knows what that word means. There's new standards. They've been out for over a year. We just need to change from the old standard to the new standard. And with the innocence of youth that I don't have anymore, he said, "What's the problem? Why is it so hard, Daddy?" So I want to start with that. Why is this transition a little different from prior transitions that have been done around cryptography? What makes this one so challenging? Maybe Michael, I'll start with you because I know you've been looking at this for a while.
Yeah, I think there are a number of reasons why it's far more challenging before. If we look back to, for example, when the world started moving from RSA to elliptic curve 20 years ago, the world was a far simpler place. There were far fewer devices, far less connectivity between devices. and I think far less standards in the world as well. So the situation was far different, and it's still an ongoing transition. There are still many parts of the world which haven't transitioned from what should have happened over 20 years ago. And the world that we have today is extremely complex. It's extremely automated. I think there are a lot more new architectures. It seems like every year there is some new technology which comes in. So the number and variety of systems that are out there has also exploded. So essentially the complexity of the problem has really increased. And I think the key lesson that was not learned in previous transition is if you're going to touch something as important as cryptography, better make sure that you document and govern it properly so that next time you have to do it, it's a simpler job. Unfortunately, that lesson was not learned, and we're really at the stage now where we have very little idea where all of the cryptography is. If you're building a product, you may do because you've developed it. But if you're using other people's products, if you're using open source, if you're using and supply chains of, maybe that's the other thing, supply chains are far more complex than they were 20 years ago. We just have no way. The starting point is a very bad starting point. We didn't learn the lessons. We have a far more complex environment. Our supply chains are far more complicated. And we didn't really put the governance in place that was required. So do you need some more points? Because
I think I must say I did look, and I think all of us were chuckling a little bit when you said it should be documented properly. I mean, that is a big problem right now, that we're not seeing that full documentation. So, anybody else want to touch on that question?
Well, first of all, thank you very much to CSA for having me here. Absolute delight to be with you here this afternoon. But just building on Michael's point, other than the complexity and the diversity and the proliferation of systems, I think the same has happened on the data side as well, where you've now got this absolute explosion, perhaps even a greater explosion than the number of systems and complexity in terms of where data resides across organizations. And many large organizations today have massive footprints right across the world. And few have a complete picture or even near complete picture of what that data is, where it resides, who has access to it, and what are the sensitivity levels. So I think that just compounds the situation that Michael was alluding to.
Yeah, thank you.
Can I also say that on top of what the two gentlemen has mentioned, there's also another aspect, which is the expectations around the security that's actually expected. And these expectations are sometimes also encoded into the regulations that companies actually needs to comply with. I think this situation is actually a little bit different from the Y2K times, right? Where maybe the expectations that data, systems, and transactions all needs to be encrypted may not be as high.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the challenge, as you said there, that cryptography, and you kind of alluded to this as well, Michael. Cryptography has become so endemic in everything that we do now in terms of all the digital infrastructure. That's why I was pleased to hear that people are. I think in general, I'm seeing a lot more awareness of how this would impact the digital fabric, essentially, that we have in the trust systems. Taekwon, I know you've worked in many multi-factor authentication, other related technologies. What are your thoughts in terms of how endemic this is, and how impactful it would be?
Well, I look at it from really at the implementation level, and we've been doing this for a number of years already. One of the observations we've had when trying to do this migration is the lack of talent in this area. Unfortunately, cryptography, which was a hot topic, in the universities in the 90s, became a boring topic anymore. It was a solved problem, right? So if you attended the RSA conference earlier this year, Professor Algamau said, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry because I made RSA so good and SSL so good, no one even bothered to do anything." So no one wanted to learn the nuts and bolts about cryptography. No one bothered. If I can just call a function dot encrypt and function dot decrypt, magic happens. Magic. Now, this magic is no longer the magic that we can trust. and we have to go in there and fix that magic. And this is where we have a problem because, I was shocked to even discover that university undergraduate degrees for computer science or for cybersecurity has cryptography as an optional module. It's freaks me out. I mean, like, what? You're learning cybersecurity and cryptography is an optional module. So if we don't have the people who have lived and breathed these kinds of stuff at the bits and bytes level and understand the math in more complete understanding rather than just dot encrypt and dot decrypt. And now we have to move to post-quantum cryptography, which is fundamentally a lot more difficult than just moving from RSA to ECC. Then we have a problem, right? So you couple the whole what Michael mentioned about the proliferation of so many devices and the demands that everyone wants 7 by 24, they want 99.999 kind of availability, plus the lack of talent to be able to then solve this at really the base level is going to be our challenge for post-quantum migration.
Yeah, so there are issues or challenges, let's say, at a couple of different layers, right? One is at the layer we're talking about just now in terms of cryptography and understanding and doing the upgrades and so on. I've had the pleasure in the last month or so of speaking with a lot of board members on this topic, and there's starting to be awareness there. But I think what's really needed to get more awareness is what does the use of that cryptography mean for my business processes, and what is going to happen if things break down. And I feel like that's an important part of it. But usually then it still runs into, I want to bring up the issue of Q day and timing, why now? Because I think that there is a challenge where you're trying to prioritize the top 5 issues that you have, let's say. We know that the impact that this will have is huge, right? It's really going to devastate the entire digital interaction that we have. Good news is we have time. Bad news is we don't know how much time, and that leads to procrastination, right? Or pushing it out, or just actually, it's not even as, it's just that it's very hard to prioritize without getting in the business process.
Actually, I'm not really that worried that we don't complete the migration. There are systems out there that are still using triple DES, right? We know that for a fact. It's unspoken, and and we say no choice. Legacy equipment, we cannot do anything about it, and triple DES still goes on. And we know triple DES can be broken. Yet there are production systems. There is money being protected using triple DES, and it goes on. So it's not so much that we must complete everything, but it's about really making sure that the bad guys cannot get the easy pickings, right? That we take away that easy low hanging fruit of breaking cryptography from these guys. And once that is done, and with proper mitigations in place, we can then have life to go on.
So I think that kind of gets into the same issue of, from what I've heard a lot over the last 6 years or so, there's sort of a carte blanche statement made that you need to upgrade everything, as opposed to being fit for purpose. I'm starting to hear that a little bit more in the actual threat model. I wonder, Chan Wei, I know you've looked at various technologies and a layered approach and so on. Are there any learnings that you've had from that where you would say that there are different capabilities that technology has that might address different threat models?
Yeah. So we actually tried a few different things. So because from an IMDS angle, we have an industry development angle, but we are also responsible for the telco sectors. So actually, we went together with the telco industry to really look more in depth into some of the things and how to actually perform some of this migration. So to the point, actually, at the board level, I think there's a question about we want to do the migration, but every company today have so many systems, so much data. Like, what do you actually prioritize? And I think that needs to be the top of mind of how you actually go about prioritizing, because the first few systems that the company actually has to do the migration on is a little bit like a guinea pig at the moment, right? Because we might know about the NIST algorithms, and it's also possible to study from the algorithms how it's actually being pushed into all the various standards. And for a lot of companies, they may not own the entire stack. So it may be a mixture of supply chain players as well as their own development products. So just getting a complete view of the cryptography assets, I think is can be a little bit of a challenge today. And from those assets to actually be able to prioritize and say, well, these are the few things that need to transition first, and have the confidence that at the systems level, when you transition, it does not break operations. I think it's an area of concern for a lot of companies today, because it is quite a big jump from talking about algorithms being quantum safe all the way to saying that my systems can still operate in the efficiency and the performance today, despite all these supply chains moving at different speeds. Yeah, I think this is something where taking a look at it from a more ecosystem lens is something that we are actually concerned about, and we actually want to be able to proactively address to make sure that there are options, there's awareness, but from awareness also the ability to translate that into concrete actions for the company.
Good. Yeah. Vikram, I think you might be looking to add something there.
Perhaps just adding on your earlier point about how do we get this prioritized correctly, so that I think, as we are all aware, there certainly is enough time if we start moving now in a timely fashion to transition in a very planned, orderly way to be quantum ready. Regulators around the world are giving different time frames. In Australia, for example, we're suggesting by 2030 we should be ready. Other places are saying somewhere around the early 2030s. I think the disconnect that we're seeing is that if you look at the tenure of most chief information security officers within organizations, they are sub 5 years typically. And as you said, they've got so many things on their plates which they need to prioritize. There's a sort of drive to potentially work on those items which are nearer term and can show results within the tenure of that person's position. So I was very happy to hear you say, Colin, and I think our experience is the same, that the conversations are now being elevated to the board level. And these are people who have custodianship for the company, not just show results in 12, 18, 24 months time frame, but long-term success of the company. Yeah. And the more we can get them sensitized to take ownership of this, potentially nominate somebody within the board who has carriage of this particular agenda item, I think is a trend we're starting to see. And I think given more and more regulation, or certainly advisories that are coming out around the world, I think it is starting to encourage more boards to actively take ownership of this item.
Yeah, I think ironically, it's the inertia part of a board that is helpful here, because they do have greater inertia and they're not reacting on a daily basis to technology changes. Michael, I think you wanted to.
Yeah, I would just like to contrast prioritization against having the right things available at the right time to be actually able to do something. Mm-hmm. So, because I think in order for that to happen, what needs to be prioritized are things like motivating the supply chain, for example.
Right.
So there are many things which are, you might prioritize can be different things, but there's this aspect, that's an important system, I need to do something. But at the end of the day, and this is an example from my organization, essentially, that if clients do not come to our product owners and say, we need this, then our product owners will not go to the standards organizations that they need to update and work there to develop a standard that sometime later would need to be implemented and maybe assured and made available to the client. So there's that consists of a whole lot of latency. And so prioritization, I think it can mean this system is important, or it can mean the things that I need to be doing to get the bits and pieces that I need in time for me to be able to do something. And I think the latter is a far easier thing to do than actually touching things. And the worst thing that can happen is you say, that's really important. Dear Mr. Supplier, when can I get my new product?
Yeah.
And they say 4 or 5 years when the standards are ready and I've implemented. So there also needs to be a discussion, I think, or clarity around the prioritization.
Yeah, and I think what you're suggesting, and I say it to clients quite often, is there's nothing wrong with just putting demands on your suppliers. It comes for free, right? Just ask them.
Exactly.
Ask them. You might get something back, you might not, but at least you're putting some pressure on. Vikram?
If I could just add to that, absolutely. And I think for most large organizations, I don't know where the split lies, but 60, 70% of the technology, maybe even 80 in some cases, is provided by suppliers and the security that's built into that. However, we've been doing some work with a very large global organization, footprint in about 160 countries, and doing some early experimentation, in terms of what you prioritize. So it's kind of understanding what you need to do. That's the very first step. And out of that process, what's come out of it is the fact that they've recognized that for the 20, 30% that's their piece of the puzzle, it's a non-trivial exercise. So I can't just pick up a shiny piece of software or hardware or get a third party to supply it and I'm quantum safe. Just positioning their own systems to be able to ingest these new technologies, upgrade their own systems where required, is a multi-year journey. So by having that assessment and that awareness early on, it allows them to plan correctly, allocate budget, which is critical, so that when the technologies are available, they're able to act in a timely manner.
Yeah. So I'm going to actually go to, there's a question that's popped up, which I think it's appropriate to this conversation, because we're talking generally about, I guess, motivations and drivers for change. And there's been discussion over the years about where, regulations are and so on, standards, but maybe even prior to that, like-minded governments, and we've heard about ecosystem, public-private partnership. Is there a way for like-minded governments to collaborate to sort of elevate this more to an interoperable type scenario across different regions? Chen Wei, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I think there are definitely ways in which we are actually looking to collaborate with other governments. One is, of course, really around some of these regulations in terms of timeframes, as well as what is it that what will the regulations actually cover. But there's also another aspect which is really around maturing some of the technologies, especially if it's going to be cross-border. We spoke a little bit about the need for interoperability, making sure the systems actually work. So for a lot of large multinationals, I think that already is a consideration. But when you look at G2G kind of infrastructure, and some of the infrastructure cuts through many layers, some of which can be proprietary in nature. In that regard, I think there's actually quite a lot of space actually for co-creation together. Co-creation of the technologies, also understanding of the interoperability standards that are actually going to be needed in this space.
Good, thank you.
Perhaps just to offer.
Okay, go ahead. I mean,
sorry,
Vic,
please. Go ahead.
Okay, so to really add on, so I don't represent the government, but I think one of the most important things is really the reconciliation and alignment of the regulations and standards itself, right? We see countries already announcing what algorithms are allowed and not allowed, and what are the dates and times that they need to actually get that whole thing done. And if they conflict, then as a vendor, we struggle, right? I give a very simple example. If you look at CNSA 2.0, which is what's used in the US, it says SHA-256 is great, right? Use it, that's great. You can continue to use it, and it's good for my CIA and FBI. And then if you go and see the Australia ASD, it says, nope, you cannot use SHA-256. And then, so if Australia and US needs to talk, I don't know what to do. That kind of regulation really confuses us. At least, from a vendor perspective, do I take it as an opportunity or a threat myself?
And I just want to add one more point actually to Michael's conversation about priority. I think that the point that I'm actually very worried about is open source. There's so much open source out there. There's so much that vendors and even large corporations rely on open source. And the business model of open source is fundamentally different from this whole B2B things, right? Who's paying these open source guys to upgrade the open source to post-quantum? And if I have a priority and I'm relying on some open source and I invest my own time to to put it in, would it get superseded? Would it, and all the other questions that come into play. And this open source question is not quite answered. It's just unspoken as well.
So I think part of what you're doing there is you're highlighting that a lot of the traditional, what we would call cyber hygiene activities, have maybe not had as much attention as they should have in the last 20 years, right? Now, quantum is a nice lens to shine on that. That's opening up the dialogue again.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a point about what like-minded partner governments can do. So if you have the mindset, it's about making sure the right things are available at the right time so that people can do something. There are many things, such as standards, it was mentioned. There are many hundreds of standards which have not been looked at from the sense of being made quantum safe. So for governments to actually go to the standards organizations in their countries and say, please give me a list of all of the standards which contain impacted cryptography, would be a very simple way. So I think there's a lot of, because what we don't want is a linear roadmap. What we want to do is actually everything that we can parallelize to shorten the roadmap is a good thing. And there are open source, things like open source, there are things like standards where government could actually play a significant role in making sure that they are ready a bit earlier than would normally be the case if we left everything to evolve serially.
And perhaps just to add a quick further observation is that, much as we would like to harmonize standards, but I think the reality of the geopolitical situation we find ourselves is that we are seeing fragmentation of standards bodies. So it might be bifurcated or multifaceted. So I think coming back to Taekwon's comment there, I think there may be no easy solution around that. We will have to, if we are to interoperate globally, find ways to support multiple potentially competing systems at the same time. And I think you highlighted the case, even amongst like-minded countries, we're seeing divergence. So certainly under ones which may have different perspectives, we're seeing some significant divergence on the standards. And that's where potentially, so we've been doing a little bit of work with the GSMA, and they've been, this is the global mobile body, where they're trying to bring together operators from diverse economies and to perhaps work towards some common standard which allows, so if you have your cell phone, you can move across and securely communicate across the various geographies. So potentially, other than the G2G efforts, there may be an important role for bodies such as this, which are industry bodies, which are global.
Yeah, and I think that we've discussed a lot since we started the panel here around some of the challenges and the unknowns and so on, but there has been a lot of good work as well, as you were just alluding to, right, in terms of a lot of bottoms-up approach and organizations getting together. I'm pleased to see some of the ecosystem type relationships, and there's a lot of talk about this. I guess, would government to government communications, would board level awareness, that's likely to try and drive things forward. So I feel we're at a good spot here. The challenge continually is the timing and the unknown on that. Not going to put you on the spot, Michael, in terms of IBM's, because I think IBM's fairly public in terms of where they're going with regards to quantum computers and the likelihood that one would evolve. But what are your thoughts around Q-Day as a definitive date versus, probability of them being available? And what do you think about that? How should we think about that in terms of a definitive date or not?
So experience has shown that you need a concrete date, otherwise there'll be a lot of discussion. So Jaime from Santander calls it crypto procrastination, essentially, and it's right. What's clear is that there won't be a single Q-Day. It depends on what sort of cryptography you're using, how long the keys are, and on multiple things. And but you don't want to get into a discussion trying to explain the evolution of quantum machines. Most people don't understand it, and they need something very simple to focus around. And from that perspective, the Q-Day is, I think, an important dimension. I do have to say I was recently at a conference with somebody who looked at the psychology of strong messaging. And what they did say about Q-Day was that it's maybe very good at the start, but at some point it might lose its impact that the closer you get, and you might need another term or another rallying or another hashtag to motivate people. So, but to summarize, right now you need something very concrete for people to work to, whether that is a date. It's a date at the end of the day, whether and it's just easy working to calendar dates because people understand those rather than a date that you're going to debate about. So it's important, but we do need to be a bit careful.
If I could just add a thought to that, I think absolutely, Michael, if you have a clear date, it's certainly a call to action. But given, where we see ourselves in quantum computing and the difficulty of perhaps putting down a concrete date, one of the effective things in our conversations with large organizations we found is to think of it through a risk-weighted lens. And so there's a lot of work done. In fact, there's a report that comes out annually from Canada, the Quantum Threat Timeline Report, where they survey about 40-odd world experts. And they ask a very clear and relatively simple question. I think it's the beauty of it, of, what do you think amongst various periods, 0 to 5 years, 5 to 10 years, 10 to 15, etc., is the likelihood that you'll see a quantum-enabled adversary that can break RSA 2048-bit in 24 hours? So lovely question. I think that's the genius of it, to come up with something that simple. And out of that, they put out each year a risk-weighted heat map. And in that, what you find is that for most organizations, you see that the risk level crosses a threshold that most organizations are comfortable with. And when you think about companies that you may be involved with, particularly larger ones or government organizations, we go to extraordinary measures to protect against risks, which are probably sub 1%. We spend millions of dollars on that. So each organization can make its own judgment on this, but for many, you see that risk threshold crosses a level of comfort well within that 10-year time frame, somewhere in 5 to 10. And I think we found that really resonates with boards. It gives them at least some framework within which they can reasonably start to think about this, allocate budgets, and plan work towards it.
So I'm just reading that these mics are now working, so we can put now use it again. Thank you, Vikram. So one of the questions that came up earlier was around cryptographic agility. The way that we tend to look at that is again, it depends on definition, but if cryptographic agility is the ability to upgrade algorithms, these ones plus subsequent ones, I do feel that there's broader context around that, more resiliency, and I think we've touched on this a little bit as well. Like, there are other aspects around supply chain and so on that are more than just upgrading algorithms. To get to that resilient type implementation, again, I wonder if through the National Quantum Safe Network plus initiatives, how have you looked at different technologies, Chen-Hui, in terms of, pros and cons and defense in depth type activities?
Yeah. Thanks a lot for that question. Actually, when it comes to our view of the kind of quantum safe migration that's probably going to be needed at the whole ecosystem level, we don't see it as like, is it a PQC kind of thing, or must there be QKD at certain parts? We kind of think that from an organization's perspective, the stack is probably, and the supply chain is probably going to be fairly complex, right? So from our perspective, there are a few things that I think probably needs to be done. One is to actually evaluate which of the systems are a priority, which I mentioned just now. But there's also another aspect, which is really around, if we actually embark on the quantum safe migration process, how do we actually ensure that the performance of the algorithms is actually up to mark? So there's a question here about, so what does good looks like, right? Today, there are a lot of our classical cryptographies. We have certain understanding of the kind of resources that they need. we have certain understanding of the kind of latencies that they will actually generate. But when we actually look at porting some of the PQC algorithms into the mission-critical networks of today, like for example, in the telco networks, which requires very low latency, and where there are certain specific protocol implementations around the transmission sizes and all that makes certain expectations that the cryptography needs to be done at a certain performance level. I think there's a level of adaptation into the individual systems that actually needs to be evaluated and actually needs to be understood, right? And so it's really for the enterprises who are running the systems to actually kind of figure out, actually even across the entire system and across the entire stack, where are some of the business critical functions which actually places extra requirements onto some of these algorithms. And I think this is something that can be done ahead of time, whether the vendors are ready or not. Because then it opens up the conversation with the vendors, right? On how do we actually co-create or how do we actually experiment to figure out whether the performance actually meets the mark. So there's a part that is really about systems performance. And then the second part is really for some of these mission critical systems, there may actually be a need to actually examine the security properties, right, from an end-to-end systems level, whether the security properties can actually be upheld. And this is something tricky but essential to do, and it's part of the complexity of the migration process, because the vendors in a system, if you have a very complex and very deep supply chain, actually they're all migrating at slightly different speeds. And in the migration process, as they are implementing some of the algorithms, they may be implementing at different times. So on a systems to systems level, you will actually already have a situation where you have a mixture and a hybrid of different kinds of algorithms, different stages of transition that are already happening. And I think from an organization's perspective, how do you actually ensure that your business functions can continue to operate well? I think it's something that actually requires quite a lot of understanding of testing and also of what exactly is it that you need to test. Because as long as the standards are not out, actually it's difficult to define what actually needs to be tested in order to have that assurance that things work across vendors and across our subsystems.
So to remain resilient, it's almost like it feels almost like a biological ecosystem, right? Where there are different things at different phases, and you have to kind of accept that.
Yes.
I think that part of the challenge that we've seen over the last 5 years or so is you can't really make definitive statements and say, just do this and everything will be fixed, because you need to accept that it's an imperfect world. There's different motivations, there's different geographical considerations in terms of what's being upgraded when. There's nothing wrong with putting some pressure on the system and trying to encourage, more adoption, but ultimately it feels like it's not going to be a clean transition, but it may be an orderly one. Back to the word you used, Vikram. I did an interview once and said, I hope it's a boring, perfunctory transition, right? With nothing to see here. But to do that, I think it's going to have to be done sort of from the ground up and through the supply chain and so on. Michael, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that cryptographic agility is a subset of organizational agility. The largest component of organizational agility is typically the supply chain, meaning if your supply chain is not agile, you will not be agile. So that's why it's a very important aspect to look at. And the other things are from a architectural and modernization perspective. So modern agile organizations use modern agile methodologies, CI/CD pipelines. They use kind of like container platforms. They use automation. They use automated deployment. If you have all of those things, you're a pretty agile organization, and the migration will be much simpler than for organizations that don't have those organizational agility capabilities. So I think just to put it in perspective, because there are many things. It's about changing crypto, but for most people that means changing the things that crypto is in, not the crypto itself. And so it's all part of a normal, modern, agile development.
I mean, it feels like
concept,
almost
yeah.
we need to take the word quantum out and we need to take the word cryptography out and just think
Yeah.
what system updates need to be done, right? And start to do it through normal, like, I don't know, PKI upgrade or, a new identity system, something
I
like
think
that.
precisely right. I think that the crypto agility is too technical a word that gets relegated to the poor IT guy who has to figure out how to replace RSA with MLKEM or MLDSA. That's not crypto agility.
Yeah.
I mean, as what Chen Hui said, right? It's a business function. I have a certain performance. I have certain critical requirements. I have to be met, and your system needs to be resilient enough to meet these business requirements. So it's a business requirement. It should then, as what Michael said, have that business agility to deliver on what's promised, and not just simply can I swap one algorithm out for another. It shouldn't be driven at that level. So I think Colin, is what you say. We perhaps should update the QRI and change the word crypto agility to something more business-like.
I do think that elevation of discussion, I do think it's been happening in the last couple of years where it's much more, and I think you said it, Chen Wei, business continuity. And I mean, if it was through the lens of business continuity, I do think, because usually panels, and I think we avoided it because there was an excellent introduction that gave the context, but usually panels start about what is a quantum computer, when is it going to be here? But wait, there's more. There's harvest now, decrypt later, right? And that's usually used as a timing consideration. I think that some of those, they're almost taking away. Something needs to be changed because there's a threat out there that's likely to happen in the next 10 years. To mitigate that, good news is there's standards available. You need to upgrade them or have your vendors upgrade them in a lot of cases. So how do we build that into our business operations so that when you plan to do an update or you plan to make something obsolete, you don't touch that one?
Just adding on that, really, it's not going to be that up till this date where we weren't crypto quantum ready, and post this date we are. I think, as colleagues have commented, it's going to be a multi-year journey. And what we have to be, I guess, in terms of the agility, is be able to support your legacy in what you have today, as well as progressively ingest new standards as they're released. We actually were recently speaking to a market analyst who in turn had been speaking to NIST. And the guidance there was that over the next 10 years, every quarter, they're expecting to release a new standard. They might be bunched, but there's something like 40 expected to be announced over the next decade. So roll that out. That's one per quarter over 10 years. It won't be that regular, but that's the kind of pace of change that we can expect.
No. Which one of the questions I saw earlier was, how will we know when we're there? Are the kids in the back of the car, are we there yet? I mean, how will we know that we're there? It's very hard to say definitively. And we've never been able to say that around security, right? You can't say it's perfectly secure. Yep. But is it adequately secure and is it fit for purpose? Because again, I think because of especially when you get into harvest now, decrypt later, and the notion that data are being stolen, which I'm sure they are, and that is a threat. But again, we think the bigger impact, I should say, is on business operations through the lack of trusted connections. And I wonder if that will be a primary driver for upgrades. Suddenly, your 10 peers have upgraded and you haven't. Can they still trust you to do business with you? That may be a great motivation. And I would offer probably more effective than potential regulations down the line.
I think that are we there? It really depends on what data you're protecting, as well as what kind of a business are you. And in the end, these will be judgment calls. And certainly in many countries, we're starting to find regulators asking the question of boards that, do you feel that the data for which you have custodianship is adequately protected? And in the end, the board will have to make a judgment. Okay, well, I've got this diversity of data. I've got these sets of technologies protect this. This does not need to be protected, but this is really critical, and I need to protect it well. And that definition of well, year to year, will vary in the face of the threat environment, but it will be a call that boards will increasingly have to be making.
Yep. Michael.
I just wanted to say that Bruce Schneier used to describe security as a process,
Yep.
nothing else, and the
Yeah.
process shouldn't ever really stop. And because the threats won't stop, we will always be subjected to new threats, whether it's AI, whether it's quantum, maybe it's light-based computation in the future, something like this. So it's about state of the art. It's about the process to simplify always being state of the art, I think. So in some ways, I think you can look at it as the maturity of an organization in terms of its agility and its resilience, rather than, it's very difficult to draw a, check, this algorithm's been replaced. So I think this concept of maturity models and really being state of the art is somehow in the process is maybe a better framing.
And I hope it's not check mark based, right? I hope it's not a compliance, because I want to actually come back to something Vikram said as well. You talked about judgment call, right? And it's hard for a board member, let alone the CISO, to make a judgment call when the conversation is in the bowels of cryptography, right? How is that really? And then again, how do you get that to be prioritized? So I really think an important part of this is the collaboration and the ecosystems, whether it's government to government, whether it's private sector, all this collaboration. I think it's very important to articulate this in a way that makes sense to people that are making that judgment call, right? So that they can understand.
I like to take on Chen Hui's point. Right? She mentioned about security principles, and these are really business level descriptions. We are talking about confidentiality and then going to authentication and stuff, and the security principles that define what the business needs would therefore then allow for the prioritization of what needs to be done from a migration standpoint. The question that I'm reading here makes it come across like you just need to do one migration and then you're good, and I'm good. It's just whether how fast or how slow that migration happens. And it's a process. You probably will never complete that migration. You probably continue for the next, I have a job for the next 20, 30 years, but it means that migration never happens because there's so many other things that we have not yet even tried to figure out. We're only talking about harvest now, decrypt later, which is a very present threat, I know, but there is all the other threats about authenticity of data, digital signing, documents, passwords, and calling biometrics, as you said. None of these have been really fixed in any way. And the standards, as what Vikram said, is still being developed over the next 10 years. So migration may never complete. It's really about a whole migration process that needs to happen.
Yeah, so we've talked about that process, we've talked about prioritization, and I think we've alluded to the consequences of a threat model, perhaps. And that was something I've noticed is coming up in the last couple of months at various events is, again, sort of back to fit for purpose and what is the actual threat. I feel like maybe in this case, we, as a collectively an industry, we jump ahead to saying you need to upgrade all the cryptography, but maybe we need to think about it more in terms of what the use cases are. And maybe that's a role for international collaboration. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, I think for me, it comes back to your point that the best cryptography is cryptography that you don't, because people don't understand it. It's cryptography you don't see. Here it just works. Yeah. Experience in my own organization, we have around 3,000 internal application owners. We sent out a questionnaire, cryptography related. People's eyes just roll over. It's just one of those topics that actually makes people frightened because they don't understand it.
Right, yeah.
Meaning that, like this question here is, I think we have to start to learn to talk to people who need to understand in a non-cryptographic way, because just observe that they turn off very quickly. And maybe we do need to take the cryptography out of the a lot of words.
Maybe I know that we talked with a client in the US and they were looking for us to interview their application developers because they would be asking them, do you have cryptography in your application? No. Well, are you authenticating users? Are you storing data? Are you transporting data? Oh, yes, of course. How are you doing? And they were making cryptographic library calls, but they didn't really understand how that related to this. So somehow we've got to get away from, why we're doing this, and start to think about how is it going to affect the business operations.
I think it exactly comes down to that, Colin. It's risk, as we were talking about before.
Yeah.
What risks is your business exposed to as a result of any potential failure that might occur in that technology? So it doesn't matter what the underlying technology is, but what are the consequences for you as a business owner? And I think there have been a number of talks through the SICW where we've really talked about the importance of trust, whether it's trust in public systems that governments run, or it's trust in commercial systems where you're interacting with a bank or an e-commerce provider. So if you start, I think, formulating the discussion in those terms, in terms of risk, what does it mean for the business? Does it impact us? Trust? Does that affect, in turn, your business's ability to grow, or even potentially, if you have a breach event, you can see a significant backward movement. I think those are things that boards would probably resonate with.
So I'm going to...
Maybe can I just add a point to that, right? I do think it's important to talk in terms of risk, but a lot of times within an organization, the people who understand risk do not understand it just from a technical risk perspective, right? So you have your lawyers and auditors and all that. I think to be able to speak to them in their language about what is the implication and the need for quantum safe migration, I think is also important. So recently I was speaking to some people who actually draft regulations, not cybersecurity regulations, but much broader kind of regulations. And they were talking about what are the needs in terms of how you actually speak to in-house lawyers, right? Because they are the ones that actually advise most board members and most CEOs on the risk. And the reality is that actually embedded in a lot of different regulations around electronic transactions and all that, there are embedded assumptions about what is the right level of encryption. Now, some regulations are maybe quite specific about what kind of encryption is actually needed. Some may be a bit more outcome-based. And I think it's also important for us, people in the field, people who understand this, to be able to talk to some of these lawyers and to be able to explain to them what does that actually mean when they're actually advising their CEOs, that when solutions are actually made available out there and we are slow to transition, what that actually means for the business, right? And so it's not exactly it's not about new regulations coming out that's actually pushing for quantum safe. It's about what is your responsibility as well, even in the current state, against the current laws. This is your obligations, both to your customers as well as...
I like that. I like that notion of current obligations and what you should be doing. I'm going to put out a question. We'll come to if anybody wants to ask a live question, we still have a number here that we'll work through that have been input through the system. If anybody wants to ask a live question, we'll come to you in a second. I want to throw one question, if anybody wants to take it, because I look at risk in many different ways. And there's a risk that a crypto-analytically relevant quantum computer, that's the first time I've said it today, I think, there's a risk that it doesn't mature within, let's say, the next decade, right? Let's just say it never happens. There's a risk of that too. And maybe I shouldn't say risk, but there's a probability that it will never happen. What should we be doing now, or how should we think about it? Because again, it's all about messaging, and I think we need to be important and we're good custodians of the messaging as an industry. How should we think about that at this point? Anybody want to take some thoughts on that?
I could offer a couple of seeding thoughts. So one is, about the risk that it doesn't occur in the next decade. I think certainly if you look at the trajectory of what many companies who are leading the race in the quantum computing space, including IBM, it really you have some level of confidence that we're going to start to see some significant developments. We already are, not just on the hardware side, but regularly we're seeing improvement on the software side, which would impact cryptography. I think we had a chart that we produced a couple of months ago, which showed that something like 10 years ago, we thought it would be about 1 billion qubits would be required to break RSA 2048-bit. With recent developments, there were some algorithmic improvements that teams at Google have put out. And that's actually reduced it from 1 billion down to sub 1 million. So 1,000-fold improvement just from a better algorithm. And that process still continues. So not only do you have the improvements in hardware, but simultaneously perhaps accelerating that trajectory is the improvements that are happening in software. So I think again, coming back to that risk-weighted analysis, there is a sufficient driver for the movement across, we think, for most organizations. But let's take the scenario that you set out, that it doesn't happen, and whatever we may ascribe as a possibility. I think there are probably two quick thoughts I'd offer there. One is that increasingly, as a part of just your compliance, if you operate in particular critical infrastructure sectors, regulators are starting to require you do that. Many countries are putting out, whether it's for banking, whether it's for critical infrastructure, requirements. So, in fact, the question goes away, should you be doing anything or not? As part of being an operator in that market segment, you'll have to do it. And perhaps the final thought I'd leave there is that the more we can build this into our regular cyber hygiene strategies, the better. These are technologies which are easily becoming available. Vendors, to Michael's point, are building them into things you buy from them. And if you can include it as part of your planning in regular upgrade cycles, it's probably something you can quite easily do as a part of your normal business process.
Michael, did you want to
add a very quick one? Yeah. I mean, what we're talking about is we're estimating when it might be there. What happens if it never arrives? There's a counter risk, which is what happens if it arrives earlier, essentially. So I think you need to.
Wow. Well played, sir. I think the other aspect too, and you kind of alluded to it, Vikram, in terms of cyber hygiene, right? And I've actually asked our teams now that are doing assessments to think about the work that you are doing to assess for quantum risk. Yeah. How much of that needs the word quantum in there? Kind of goes back to what I said earlier, right? Because there's a lot of things that one discovers, never a bad time to look in the attic and find out what's going on and improve the governance, back to what you said earlier, Michael, right? So that's the way we're sort of looking at it is, would you look back and think, well, we just spent all this money specifically on quantum, or would you look back and think we're in a much stronger position around cybersecurity in general because all those things that we've not tended to in the last 10 to 20 years, now we're tending to. Did you want to add?
Yeah, well, I guess, I mean, I assume if the CRQC really doesn't materialize in 10 years, it's not just about us spending money in the quantum migration that you should be worried about. I think there will be thousands of people who will be laid off, for example, because they were spending so much money on trying to build a quantum computer that can actually break cryptography. So if we believe that it will still come, and maybe not 10 years, but 15, 20 years later, then as what Vikram said, we are still on the right track. Post-quantum cryptography is fundamentally a lot more strong and it's based on stronger security assumptions compared to what we have on RSA or ECC, right? So moving to a stronger algorithm, having the best practices on how we can have agility in our design and having all the cyber hygiene in place and the resilience in place is definitely a good thing for us. So I don't see that as anything wasted. I mean, we've moved to AES faster than anyone could break triple DES, and no one's really complained about it. Why are we complaining about it now?
And it's a good point you made as well about the little known fact that, I mean, Matt Scholl in this said a couple of times, they're just better algorithms too, right? I'm sure, Mike, I know your team was involved in a lot of the collaboration around those algorithms. I mean, the feeling is that they are better algorithms, and they also offer things like homomorphic encryption. That's another conversation, obviously, but it's good practice to do the upgrades too.
I would just frame your point, because I like it, is in the way that there's no point being quantum safe if you're completely unsafe in every area of cybersecurity. Right. Needs to go hand in hand.
Yeah. Just because you've gotten away with it doesn't mean you'll continue to get away with it, right? I mean, it's again, it's a lens, and it's putting a lot of attention in a good way on some of the practices that are in place, and so we'll take the benefits.
And just tying it back to your point that you got away till it today, and you might continue to. I think tying the other theme of this conference around AI, that's likely to expose those gaps far quicker than we have. So you might have gotten away till now, but you may not be able to so easily do so in the future.
So we have a lady with the mic back there that's desperate to get in some steps today. So if anyone has a question that they would like to ask, she will bring the mic over to you. Or else we'll just keep going through the questions that were anonymously posted. The one that's up right now is around collaboration, developing quantum safe guidance. Again, the CSA and collaborators' work that came out this morning is a very good example of that. There was an earlier question too that I'd like to go back to, which I think is, how do you tie it together? So there's high-level frameworks. There's now the NIST standards right at the bits and bytes of algorithms. There's guidance. Can that be tied together in a way that, again, resonates at the board and the CEO level? Yeah, I'll give you one thing that we tried. It's not gone far yet, but we tried to write a profile for the NIST cybersecurity framework. Well, we did write it. We posted it because we felt that might be a good taxonomy to use, and there's others too, right? But I think getting it in the taxonomy that makes sense to the CEOs and the board is a way to go.
Maybe a couple of comments here, because it comes back to people being frightened of cryptography. So if your guidance is full of cryptography and quantum, board members will not read it and use it. So this is why I have to say, if you look at what the UK has produced in terms of guidance, it's very high level, very consumable, and doesn't sort of like frighten people, and so very much about the framing. And I quite like this. And I think guidance, two issues. One is there's a lot of guidance there that sounded good at the time, was put into standards, but is not has turned out not to be so good. So we have this problem about there's lots of not so good guidance out there that's easy to find. The other one, I think, is that guidance without a strategy is also not optimal. The guidance should somehow reinforce a strategy. The things that you're not going to put in guidance, but that you want to achieve as an enterprise or a country or an industry. Because I think there's lots of things to that question that government can do. Maybe they're not quite so aware. Tweak here, 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 and here to actually move people in the right direction. But you don't want to put that in guidance. It's kind of has to become part of a strategy for your entity.
Well, I worked on the QRI in my capacity in SG Tech. So we are a trade association. CSA consulted us on the QRI, and we provided feedback. It was a team of us, 5 of us, from different organizations. And we looked at QRI very positively because the QRI for Quantum Readiness Index gave a quantified way for organizations to essentially benchmark themselves with themselves maybe a year ago or a year after, and also benchmark themselves vis-a-vis their industry or competitors. So I think board members at least understand scores, right? You are 50 upon 100 or 20 upon 100, right? I understand you are a student or a C student, right? So having that kind of quantification gave direction in terms of how far, how soon, and how much, perhaps from a budget standpoint, do you need to commit in order to get to certain scores and maintain these. Even maintaining these scores are probably going to cost money as well. So I thought that the QRI, which CSA just published, and I do recommend you guys to go take a look, really was a good step in quantifying something that had always been rather, rather more, I would say, less rigid, less solid in place. And even, yes, there may be certain other points that could have been added in, but I felt that was a fantastic first step.
Actually, one of the most common things that I've always heard from enterprises is also, to Mike's point, is really around the strategy for the entire transition. Because the big question is also around, so how much will this cost? Right? Especially if you're talking about all systems and all data actually needing to transition into something that's quantum safe. Right? So it sounds like a really huge endeavor. And the question is, will the cost also be exorbitant? And so I think from an organization level, for the kind of conversations with the board is also about how do you actually optimize that transition process? So for example, some systems that are actually going to be refreshed, maybe you should wait for that natural refresh cycle to actually think about the transition process. So there are aspects of this that I don't know whether it will be in a regulator-led kind of guidance, but there are strategies like that that I feel is very transferable and that should actually be more proliferated.
Okay, thanks. So I'm going to give you each about a minute or so to give some final thoughts. So maybe I'll talk for just 30 seconds so you can get your thoughts assembled there. But I think this was an extremely good panel. Thank you so much for all of your input. I think some of the lessons that I would take away from this is sort of elevation of the communications. We didn't really talk about incentives, and I'm not sure what incentives would be, but I think somewhere in there, as public and private partnerships are formed, maybe there becomes a notion, and maybe the incentive is more of a disincentive in terms of reduced trust. If you're not upgrading, I think one of the market forces that will play out is that the bottom line will be affected for companies, especially if, again, if all your peers have upgraded and you have not, then that's likely to affect the bottom line at some point. So maybe we'll start at the end there with take, and we'll work our way down.
I mean, the message is still clear, right? You have to start and really start now. I think that really is the point. Quantum, post-quantum or quantum safe migration is not an easy topic. It's not a quick thing. It's going to take a lot from the organization, both internally as well as externally, in order to get that journey even started. And having small pilots to start now is definitely the way for the organization to learn, not just about the technical side of it, but how to get your budgets in place, how to convince your board, and how to even measure how well you are in that journey itself. So starting now, I say, please don't wait.
Vikram?
Just building on Taekwon's message there, yes, I think the general guidance is begin that process now. It's a multi-year journey. But the critical piece to be able to get started, I think, is what you were just mentioning in your closing comments there, is to get alignment from your board and your C-suite. That is critical. Try and develop languages in the business case which would justify to release budget. All around the world, what we're seeing is there are financial pressures. Organizations are being pulled in many different ways. So you need to think about what will present the business case in a way to your board that will allocate those budgets and enable the commencement of this journey as Taekwon just laid out.
I'm going to echo a bit of what Vikram as well as Taekwon has been saying. It is going to be a multi-year journey. By all accounts, what we are hearing from various parties is first, do get that level of executive support, because in order to plan the entire transition, in order to get that financing that's actually needed, it's actually going to be something that is multi-step and probably going to be multi-year. Multi-step in the early stages, if you're going to be an early adopter in this space, there are a lot of conversations that you need with vendors, both in your existing IT vendors as well as dedicated quantum safe vendors, in order to have the conversation about what that early transition will actually look like. So until you get familiar, then you can talk about that propagation across the entire systems. And in order to actually start on that process, it's important to be able to engage the C-suite as well as the board. Talking in terms of what are the priorities and why they need to be priorities, talking in terms of the implications to the business, then I think it will be easier to get that support and easier to actually start on that journey to really be very concrete about what can actually change.
Great, thank you. Michael?
For me, if we talk about migration, it shouldn't be quantum safe migration. It needs to be migration to a better place. And that is about being safe in the quantum era. And that is about all of the cybersecurity hygiene things that we've talked about. It's about being resilient. So moving from a cybersecurity perspective to a cyber resilient perspective. It needs to be part of a value proposition, not a cost proposition.
Well stated, well stated. Well, thank you very much, panelists. Great discussion. And I think we're to remain on stage and get some photographs taken, but I wanted to thank the audience for their attention on this topic.
And a very big thank you to our moderator, Dr. Colin Sutar, as well as our panelists. We truly appreciate your time, expertise, and the valuable perspectives you shared with all of us.